Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Miss Jennifer Blank, and welcome to Unit 8, The Build-Up to the Civil War. This is Part 2 in a series of 4 PowerPoint presentations and Part 1 of 3 videos. So Part 1 of the PowerPoints is data analysis. That does not have a video attached to it, which is why we only have 3 videos, because that is something my students need to take a look at. There's some key questions at the end of it, so I'd like you to take a look and answer those after you're done taking a look at that data, that information. Part 2, which is what we're focusing on today, is a review of relevant previous content, sectionalism, and slavery and abolitionism. Part 3 is going to talk about key causes of the Civil War, and Part 4 is going to talk about changes in political parties. So, review of previous content, sectionalism, slavery, and abolitionism. In order to move forward and to understand the build-up to the Civil War, we need to have a sense of the immediate history that came before it so that we understand this is a process. It wasn't just cause and effect. There were several causes that led up to several different effects. It's a complex process. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So key ideas for this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about sectionalism, federalism, slavery, the Dred Scott decision, and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Those last 2 bullets are 2 of several causes of the Civil War, but since they tie into abolitionism and slavery, I'm going to talk about them here. So review. Sectionalism and federalism, the Missouri Compromise, Western expansion, nullification controversy. So let's start with sectionalism versus federalism, a little bit of a refresher. Sectionalism is basically the battle for power between the states and the national government, this power struggle that really has been in existence since our founding. Gradually, this power struggle turned into an us versus them, all right, the states' rights versus federal authority. And sectionalism effectively is when you take your region and deem it more important than anything else. Nothing else matters but your region, and that can be very, very dangerous for a society. Federalism, our system of government, is the division of power between a national government and several states. The key idea with these items is that the debate about federalism, the questions that we ask over who has the authority and power to do what, and which powers go to which side, this directly led to sectionalism. And this sectionalism enabled, or rather kept us from compromising. And this inability to compromise directly led to the Civil War. So this is why we care so much about it. Now, let's take a closer look at sectionalism. Southerners dominated early national politics, and they actually were pretty on board with national interests. They were not the key problem with sectionalism. The New Englanders were. So people in the North, the New Englanders, they didn't like the Louisiana Purchase, they didn't like the War of 1812, and they mustered together the Hartford Convention in 1814 to protest the War of 1812, and this was driven by sectional motives, the idea that they wanted to insulate or protect New England from the influence of those in the South and the West. So sectionalism actually starts with New England, not with the South. This is an interesting idea that a lot of people don't realize. So our expansion in the West in the 1840s, this resulted in very intense conflicts about slavery between the North and the South. Now, one of the things that saved us during this time period was the existence of 2 very strong political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. The fact that we had these 2 strong parties anchored everybody in the nation to something national. All right, so it kind of not stamped out, but it reduced the sectional tensions because people were uniting behind a national party platform. All right, and so this helped keep us from splitting apart like we would eventually do. And the Missouri Compromise in 1820 was very, very important. Okay, Missouri was ready for statehood in 1819. In 1819, we have a balance of slave and free states. Missouri coming in as a slave would upset the balance. So what did we do about it? Well, we admitted Missouri as a slave, Maine came in as a free, and we established this line, the 3630 line, that said everything north of this line was free and everything south of the line was slave. Now, here's a map for you just so you understand. This line right over here is the 3630 line, so this is all free. This purple area, and then, or this lighter purple, pinkish area, and then this grayish purple area down below represents the slave states. Okay, so this is how we worked it out. At this point in history, Oregon does not fully belong to us, and we haven't won the Mexican-American War yet, so we don't have to deal with this territory over here. But eventually, that would become an issue. Now, Andrew Jackson is very important. He won the presidency in 1828 after a bit of a bumpy ride. His election split the Republican Party, and he became the first Democrat. He effectively founded the Democrats. He was a nationalist for the most part, but there were some sectional ideas that he was all about. Indian removal from the Southeast, He vetoed the charter of the National Bank, and he opposed any federal money for internal improvements. The last two little bullets there were very, very important and key to Henry Clay's American system. And of course, as you should know, Henry Clay and Jackson did not get along. Jackson was a little bit bitter about the election of 1824. So he opposed those, and those were key aspects of Henry Clay's American system. Now, nullification was a big, big issue. Now, John Calhoun, at the time of nullification, is Andrew Jackson's vice president. This is a little awkward, you know, hanging out in the West Wing when the VP and the Prez are kind of duking it out. So he didn't like the tariff. He didn't like the tariff of abominations, the tariff of 1828. So he proposes this idea of nullification. He said that states were the arbiters, or the negotiators, or the deciders of what was actually constitutional. So in 1832, we have an additional tariff passed. This was not good times for the South. South Carolina was not happy. So they called for a state convention to determine the constitutionality. Calhoun resigned as VP, and the convention decided, listen, we're not following this. This is null and void because it's no good. Congress, at the insistence of Jackson, passes this thing called the Force Bill, which basically gave Jackson military authority to go in and enforce the tariff. Conflict was averted, and everything calmed down with the passage of Henry Clay's Compromise Tariff of 1833. Now, the slavery issue is where we get into big stuff here. Constitution did not state anything specific about the federal government's authority about slavery. Okay, there was nothing in there that gave the federal government the authority to do anything with slavery. So the states really had the power here based on the 10th Amendment. Now, Northerners knew they couldn't get enough votes to pass an amendment banning slavery, but they figured they could forbid it in new states as they come in. So they were thinking, all right, we can't stop it right now, but we can stop it as we get new states, because they knew that was going to happen. Now, slavery in the West was a big problem, but we settled it, at least for a while, with the Missouri Compromise. But new states coming in the 1840s and 50s caused some issues. Texas came in a slave. It was balanced by Oregon, which was free. However, you have California and New Mexico. What do we do about those? Well, they were south of the Missouri Compromise line, which was kind of an issue for the South. The South was like, listen, they should be slaves. They're south of the line. But then these other people came up with this idea of popular sovereignty, that the citizens, the residents of those territories could determine whether or not they were slave or free. So it was an open question. This massively ramped up sectional tensions because now people need to campaign to convince those residents to go slave or to go free. Now, talking about the growth of slavery, this is a big, big issue. It's largely economic. As I've said in previous presentations, you can trace almost every major event back to an economic cause of some kind. So at this point, the South has about 4 million slaves. Slave owners are only 25% of the population. All right, 17% of the population had 1 to 9, 7% had 10 to 99, but only 1% had over 100 slaves. So you're talking about a very small percentage of society controlling most of it. You've got 1% of the population of the South controlling everything. So that's a big problem. Massive economic inequality. The Southern argument was that it was labor-intensive agriculture. So we have to import slaves because we can't get enough whites to do the work. So slavery has to exist because it's what the Southern economy is based on. Now, the economic base is important to talk about. Let's talk about this for a minute. So I want to give you some numbers because this should shed some light on why this was such a big issue. So in 1800, cotton is worth about $5 million, the exports, 7% of total exports. In only 30 years, that goes up from 18 million to 300 million. Now, from $5 million to $30 million in value, and we're at 41% of total exports. That's huge. In another 30 short years, you've got $191 million value and 57% of total exports. So you can see what a major economic issue slavery really was. It was bigger than morality and ethics and societal questions, and cultural questions. This is an economic issue. Now, let's talk about abolitionism, the responses to slavery. So abolitionists, they had the Underground Railroad. They barraged Congress with a bunch of anti-slavery petitions. They established the Liberty Party to fight it. And we had some peaceful, which Frederick Douglass, some peaceful abolitionists. But we had other very violent abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison is an example of that. Now, There's a picture of Frederick Douglass. He's a very important guy. We're going to talk about William Lloyd Garrison first. He rejected this idea of gradualism, the idea that we should do things slowly, that we should allow society to adjust to getting rid of slavery. He said, nah, right now, people, right this second, with all deliberate speed. So he was not okay with gradualism. He wanted emancipation by any means necessary. Frederick Douglass was a little more amicable to compromise and a little bit more gradual about things. He was actually an escaped slave himself. He published the North Star, which was a very important Underground Railroad publication, and he published a narrative of his life, which highlighted some of the struggles that slaves had to go through. Uncle Tom's Cabin, very important novel, published in 1852, totally ramped up interest in abolitionism, so it's very important. Now, there are a couple of, about 6 key reasons that anti-abolitionists gave for why slavery was good. Biblical, historic, and economic. So slavery was ordained by God. It's in the Bible, folks. It's historic. The best civilizations of all time have had slavery. Listen, it's economic. If the Southern economy fails, then the U.S. economy is going to fail, and the Southern economy will fail without slavery, so we need to keep it. The other 3 were wage slave, spiritual, and scientific. Now, the idea of slavery was preferable or better than the people who were a slave to factories in the North. The northern system was worse. Spiritual. We were benefiting the blacks who had traded the barbarism of Africa for the blessings of Christianity. And it was scientific. Southerners and many people of this time period, not just Southerners, believed that slaves were lower on the evolutionary chain. So their minds were not as developed. They needed somebody to watch them. Who better to watch them than whites? Now, John Calhoun was probably the greatest advocate for this. He said, if you end slavery, you're going to have a race war. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Don't destroy a system that benefits us. And the other, the slavery civilized Africans, we talked about that. Tariffs equal a bad economy. Slavery does not equal a bad economy. He said, if you want to fix the economy, get rid of the tariffs. Slavery is helping the economy. And then the last bullet we've already talked about. Dred Scott is very, very important. The Supreme Court case Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857. So the slave, Dred Scott, sued for his freedom. He said he shouldn't be considered a slave because he'd lived in free territory. So now he's no longer a slave. But the Supreme Court said, no, sorry, sweetheart. You are not a person. Therefore, you're not a citizen. And you have no standing to sue. So therefore, you are still a slave. And so this caused a lot of problems. But the most important result of this was that it removed the Missouri Compromise. Chief Justice Roger Taney declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. So this bridge that we built between the North and the South was now destroyed. We had to come up with something else to replace it. So this ramped up sectional tensions as well. Now, John Brown was a very rabid abolitionist, very similar to William Lloyd Garrison. He wanted to spark a slave rebellion to force the South to free the slaves. He attacked a U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He was captured very quickly and executed. Now, his raid really caused a lot of problems on both sides. The northern abolitionists were rallied. The southern anti-abolitionists started forming militias. This is the beginning of the Confederate Army. Now I'm going to leave you with this chart. We've talked about the Dred Scott decision. We've talked about John Brown's raid. We've talked about sectionalism. In the next PowerPoint, we're going to discuss the election of Abraham Lincoln. We're going to discuss the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in addition to the Brooks versus Sumner battle. So I hope you learned what you need to. Hope this was useful for you, and I will see you next time.